Hey guys, Moneyman300 and got another tips and tricks video here, and it's another tuning in depth, and this time we are on to the springs. So we did our tires, we did our alignment, now we're up to springs, and then the next one will be roll bars. Skip over roll bars if you're going in order across there because I wanted to cover the springs first before I got over the roll bars. It's kind of the order in which I tune a car or set up the car anyway. So let's do that. The car I'm using is the Class B BMW 1M, one of my favorite Class B cars. I have the tune out there. I did a video on it. The car's a lot of fun to drive, and I'm running it on Catalunya. I believe this is whatever the middle one is. Can't remember the name off the top of my head. But not an ideal track for this car, but it does make for good demonstration purposes because it's got some of those tight turns and areas where I'm going to have to accelerate off of to give me an idea if I've got my springs dialed in. So let's hop in here and start to talk about it a little bit. So let's hop over to our springs here. And there we are. So this is the 750 676. That's where I landed on when I had originally tuned this. And what we'll do is we'll play around. We'll do some extremes and show you what happens if you have extreme settings, and then talk about why you would make adjustments to the front and the rear, and also how to get a base setup. So spring's pretty self-explanatory. I don't know that I have to explain what they do, but that obviously that's your suspension that controls your travel, different things like that. So the stiffer it is, the more responsive the car is, but also potentially the easier it's going to lose traction. The softer they are, the more that it's going to stay on the road, but you run the risk of bottoming out and losing control, and you also run the risk of it being what I would call mushy and not real responsive on your turn in and things like that. So it does, I think, tell you that. Again, the descriptions are very good. Be sure to read them. But that's just a real quick overview. But let's talk a little bit more about how do we set up our default settings. So refer back to my base tuning video, and the one method that I gave in there, and it's a method I use quite a bit, is that using the spring, the weight of the car and the weight distribution to be able to calculate spring rates. So what I'll do is I'll take a car, maybe it's 3,000 pounds, divide that by 2, and then multiply that number by the weight distribution. So let's say if we got 3,000 pounds, we divide that by 2, and sometimes I'll even divide it by less. I might go to 40, or instead of 50%, I might go 40 or 45% if I'm trying to make it a little bit softer. But for the sake of math, let's divide it by 2. That gets us to 1,500. Then I will take that 1,500 and multiply it by the percentage of weight distribution. So if I have 55% to the front, I'll multiply that 1,500 by 0.55, and that will give me my front springs. I would multiply the 1,500 by 0.45, and that would give me the rear springs. So that's a little bit of, that's one way that you can do it. It's a way that I use frequently. It's important to note that, and this is true with any calculator, if you're using a tuning calculator, there's various ones that are out there, or if you have your own method, that's a starting point only. It comes learning to do what next is experience, driving. You got to get it out on the track, and then you got to make your adjustments accordingly. I have never taken a car that I can remember and put the springs on based on my calculations and then left them there. There's always adjustments to be made, and that can only happen through getting it out on the track and driving it. So I just want to get that out there. So anyway, you get that set. That's one way you can do it. Another way, some people might just go in and take 20% off the default values. The one thing to note is they're almost always too stiff out of the box, in my opinion. Very rare that there's a few cars out there that occasionally come with some softer springs, but almost always they are too stiff out of the box and they need to be softened. Maybe softened by 10%, maybe by 20%. So you can do it a percentage like that. Take the defaults, to knock 10% or 20% off of them, and then use that as a starting point. That's perfectly good. You could also just center them up here, and people will do that a lot too, which, this one's about centered up, the rear here. Just center them both up, start there, and start adjusting. So, and over time, with rear-wheel drive cars or all-wheel drive or front-wheel drive, you'll get a feel for where to start a little bit. So, as a rule for rear-wheel drive cars, you're generally going to have the rear be softer than the front, as you see here. So it's what we'll call understeer tuned, and that's so that we tune some of the oversteer out of the car, which is natural for a rear-wheel drive car. So this is very common setup to see here, where you have the front spring stiffer than the rear. In a front-wheel drive car and an all-wheel drive car, typically that's going to be the other way around, because they tend to understeer. So we're going to be a little stiffer in the rear and a little softer in the front. So that's just a general rule of thumb. So if you're setting it up, so you might center this up. And let's do this. So I might have these both centered. Say this is about the midpoint in there, but I know that this is a rear-wheel drive car, and I'm gonna want the back a little softer. So then I may start with something like this, and then adjust from there. Or say this was moving the wrong one here. Or say I was here and this was an all-wheel drive or a front-wheel drive. Then and I thought I moved up. Hang on, go up here. Then I may start out with something looking a little closer to this. So depends on what you have, what your drivetrain is going to a lot of times drive your spring. The weight, the distribution of your weight also matters as well. So first off, let's do this real quick just to show from what can happen if you are too stiff. So I'm just going to make this as stiff as we can get it. We're going to pump them all the way to the top, and we're going to drive it, and I will describe to you what I feel going into the turn. So apply it now. We'll do that. Hit it. Let's go. Got to be able to hear. So we'll drive it in here in this first turn. Bad there, but it does not want to turn. Right there. It just wants to drive straight off the track. It just feels. I mean, it's kind of hard to describe, but it just feels really stiff. Now, could I drive it like that? Yeah, I could, but I gotta stop on that turn. So everything's real slow. So anyway, it just feels like I'm on ice skates. I'm like skating around the track. So that's what happens if you're too stiff. You get that feeling. The car is just all over the place, and it's sliding through everything. So that's what too stiff feels like. So let's go back in here. And I've never tried this before, but let's make it real soft. I've done the other trick where we do that. This will be interesting. So we'll make this all the way the other way to give you a sense of what it's like if you are too soft. Car will turn. Nothing else feels responsive though. It's like I am jamming all the way to steering lock on both of these. But to be honest, it isn't terrible. I would rather have this. And this is why I said that softer is better in this game than stiff. Now, this is great. Now it feels like if you think of a car and it feels like you're driving on flat tires, that's what this feels like. But again, this is way more drivable than if I was dealing with the car that was super stiff and on ice skates. I can actually control this. Sorry. Hard on that console, but it's still understeers, which is weird. But anyway, so there's the two extremes there. So now let's go in and let's get us back into some sort of normal type of setup here. And what I'm gonna do here is we're just gonna use the center method. Somewhere around in there is about the middle, I suppose. And I'm gonna want the rear, not that much less, but a decent amount less. So we're gonna go with that. We'll apply that. We'll get back out here. So just talk about that a little bit. So this is what I would call using the center method. Put them both in the middle. I know I want the rear to be less. This car has quite a bit of horsepower, quite a bit of torque, so I need the rear to be softer. So let's talk a little bit about that, the types of adjustments that you make, and why would I want the rear softer versus the front, and what I'm doing. Again, we go back to you tune the end that you're having an issue with. So my assumption on this is that I'm going to have the tires spinning on the rear. So I want to soften my rear springs to keep the tires on the ground more, give me more traction in the rear. So that's what I'm going for here. If So I don't adjust the front a lot on a rear-wheel drive car. Generally, on a rear-wheel drive car, you're doing most of your tuning in the rear. In a front-wheel drive car, you're doing most of your tuning in the front. But if I am getting quite a bit of understeer coming out of a turn, usually, so when I'm getting on the gas and getting some understeer there, I might go in and soften the front spring. So if you're getting understeer, typically you're needing to fix the front end and you need to soften your front springs. So in general, softening the front springs will help you eliminate understeer. If you're getting oversteer, and I'm usually tuning the springs for corner exit. So roll bars, and I'll cover that in the next one, are mid corner. Damping is really your turn in. For the most part, there's other things you can do there. We'll talk about that in a future video as well. Roll bars, mid corner, springs, corner exit is where I'm typically tuning for. So I'm looking to see, am I getting a lot of wheel spin? Am I losing the back end coming out of the corner, or am I pushing a whole bunch coming out of a corner? So when I get back on the accelerator, so those are the things that I'm tuning for. If when I get on the accelerator, it's pushing a whole bunch, then I'm gonna want to soften the front springs to keep the front wheels on the ground. If I am again losing the back end, then I'm gonna soften the rear. So right here, I've got the rear softer than the front. So let's go see how this feels. Turns here. That turn feel a little easier though already. This feels okay. Feels like I could drive this. Tip there, not bad. And then I'll talk about ride height too, because I haven't talked about yet. This feels pretty good. So let's do one other thing. So I talk about that, and instead of doing both of them extreme maximums, let's just do this just to show you guys one more. So let's say I did have this, more centered up or somewhere in here. This is where you're really going to be able to, already right there, it got loose. And it just really wants to, so coming out of the corner, you can see just now, and I'm hitting it a little bit just for effect, but right there, so you can see I'm just a little squirrely coming out of the corners when I have it that way. So that's when you'll come in. If you're feeling it squirrely like that coming out of there, come in here and get this back down. So I'm going to put this back down because it actually felt pretty good where I had it. So I had that about 580, I believe. So I'll leave that there. So that's where you're going to tune that. Now, if I was pushing at all, again, like I said, I would come in here and reduce that front spring. That's going to be more typical. You're going to make those kind of adjustments in a front wheel drive and all-wheel drive cars. All-wheel drive cars tend to understeer quite a bit, and I tend to have the front springs softer than the rear springs as well. So we'll apply that. We'll get back. Oh, what did I hit? I went back into my tuning. We'll hit the resume there. We'll make sure that it feels okay. And already right there, I can tell just a big difference right there. There was some wheel spin through there, but I had it floored the whole time there. Car hooked up good, feels good. So I got it in a place that I want it right there. I'm going to leave it there. We're going to roll with that. And the next thing we're going to look at in the series is going to be our anti-roll bars. And I can tell just by looking at this, this car is pushing a little bit, and it's probably because my front anti-roll bars are a little stiff. But we're going to talk about that in the next video after this one. I'm going to wrap it up on springs. Oh, shoot, I didn't even talk about ride height. Ride height, you want to go as low as you possibly can and not bottom out. You'll know you're bottoming out so if you're on a bumpy track, like a Sebring and the last turn in Sebring where you got some bumps that you glide over, if you're losing it in there, then your ride is too low. Bump it up a couple notches at a time. Or if you're coming in, you're diving in and you're hitting turn strips, and when you hit that turn strip, you spin out, that's probably because you're bottoming out. Those are the two most common things that I see. So you can just bump this up. There's not a lot of negative impacts, especially in these mid to lower classes, of having the car be a little bit higher. So I would err on the side of caution, make it a little higher, try it out. You might find that it's a lot more stable when you're over bumps, when you're having to run over turn strips, especially when you get into multiplayer and you got to take some lines that you're not used to. It's a little better to have that ride height just a little higher, but in general, you want to have it as low as you can and still be stable. So in this case, I don't know if this was the default or not, or if I dropped it down and went back up, but it felt okay going over those. I didn't have any major issues in there, so that's the ride height that I wanted to cover there before we left it. That's going to wrap it up for the springs. Like I said, the roll bars are next. Post any questions you have down in the comments. I'm more than happy to answer them if I can. Otherwise, we will catch you guys in the next one. Later.